Good morning, members of the National Security Council. My name is Hope Fager, and I am joined by Canton Meade, Nicholas Bradley, and Cooper Hopkin. We are the Wolverine Cybersecurity Task Force, and we will be briefing on the Trax cyber incident. The bottom line up front is that the compromise of Trax, a software used by the Mexican National Guard to facilitate border security operations, in combination with the recruitment of U.S. citizens for trafficking operations, are collectively only making complicated security measures at the border even more complicated. This requires immediate action, including collaboration with Mexico, investigation into these cartels and their operations, and the mitigation of possible but generally unacceptable escalations. The US and Mexico have been working together in the past, however, crime has only continued to rise, especially as a result of the operations of La Hermandad cartel, led by Claudia Cruz. This collaboration has resulted in the development of Trax, a software currently used by the Mexican National Guard to facilitate their border security operations. At this time, however, the US Customs and Border Patrol is not using Trax. On January 3rd, 2023, a dark web advertisement was posted, likely by La Hermandad cartel, asking for access to Trax. And it seems as though their efforts were successful. We have messages from between believed cartel members that not only dictate Mexican National Guard patrol patterns, but also how to avoid them. These messages also have revealed that they are using social media, primarily TikTok, in order to recruit US citizens for these operations. The instances of crime and violence have been increasing as a result of the insecure border. On May the 6th, a trailer was found by ICE agents in El Paso attempting to smuggle 37 migrants and 118 pounds of fentanyl over the border. And a shooting in Mexico, minutes away from the US Consulate General, led to the death of the Cardenas family. And both the shooting and the trailer are suspected to be related to the operations of La Hermandad cartel. In the US, the number of fatal synthetic drug overdoses is increasing nationwide, as is the public dissident over the situation, especially in El Paso, where a perceived lack of assistance from both federal and local governments is only leading to more public outcry. If this situation is not handled correctly, there is the potential escalation towards civil disobedience. It is imperative that the US disrupt the activities of La Hermandad cartel in order to stop the acceleration of crime and trafficking over the border. It is also important that we work with Mexico to do this, as unilateral action has the potential of putting additional strain on already tenuous relationships. However, it is also important to note that any information shared with Mexico only increases the potential of an intelligence leak.
We've identified several potential escalations that we recommend should be addressed. First is the use of compromised information from Trax that may be used to target Mexican National Guard personnel. If a cartel member can evade a patrol, they can also intercept one. In addition, this app contains not only conversations between patrol members, but also personal information, which opens up the personnel to both bribes and threats. There's also the potential of a similar compromise of Mexican and United States government apps. If a United States surveillance platform, for example, is breached, there is a high likelihood of a breach in confidential information. It doesn't matter what we share with Mexico, if these platforms are compromised, that intel will be leaked. In addition, we face increased cartel recruitment in the United States. We have already seen recruitment attempts on social media, specifically TikTok, and we run the risk of these cartel members targeting even more US citizens, specifically the younger population. We could also see the trafficking of higher risk materials and individuals. If the cartel is able to smuggle fentanyl over the border, they can also smuggle even more. And finally, we could see the threat of civilian violence perpetrated against migrant communities. We've already seen calls for violence against these communities and even calls for the formation of an unauthorized civilian militia. We have identified 3 responses that we recommend should be prioritized as outlined in your brief. First, we recommend collaboration with Mexican authorities to secure the southern border. Second, we recommend investigation into the trans-border operations of not only La Hermandad cartel, but other criminal organizations as well, to fill some of the potential intelligence gaps that we have recognized. And finally, we recommend the mitigation of impacts of these increased activity of criminal organizations. My associates, Nicholas and Camden, will be addressing these priorities in more detail.
I will be further expanding upon the collaborate section. This section contains a number of policy options which pertain to primarily communicating with Mexico in order to best handle the situation. A couple of these are immediate responses. For this, we recommend that we create an immediate task force in order to review intelligence regarding the situation and then determine whether or not we can share this intelligence with our Mexican counterparts. This would enable us to better deal with the situation and to coordinate law enforcement activity. It is recommended that DHS, DEA, FBI, NSA, CIA, and the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement be included on this task force. It is also recommended that DHS, FBI, and DEA actually use this as an opportunity to conduct a sting operation at the southern border. This can be further augmented by Mexico, who can help us to lure the cartel into an area where they can more easily be detained. We also have a number of long-term oriented policy options. This includes utilizing the DOJ to collaborate and to identify companies which could be importing chemicals used to make fentanyl and other synthetic drugs, and to prosecute these companies if necessary. It is recommended that the United States Embassy in Mexico increase their funding into Mexico's Peace Builders program, which would decrease poverty throughout the region, and that USAID expands their current humanitarian projects in Central America, which will decrease the flow of illegal immigration going through Mexico to the United States. And finally, it is recommended that the Department of Commerce subsidize fact-checking platforms. These are commonly used on platforms such as TikTok or Facebook, and it will help decrease misinformation and cartel propaganda.
Moving on to our second response priority, investigating the actions of the La Hermandad cartel. We have 4 policy recommendations for you that we recommend be implemented within 72 hours. The first is have US CERT and the original developers see if secure development practices were used in the creation of tracks, and if there's a software bill of materials following the development. This will help us understand if it's an internal or external vulnerability within the software that we need to patch. We also recommend that our aforementioned task force investigate 4 primary pillars of La Hermandad's operations. The first is the identities of anyone who posted on the dark web and anyone who may have responded. The second being distribution channels used to traffic drugs and humans into the United States. The third, information about social media accounts. This can include IP addresses, emails, etc. And finally, the identities and operations of US citizens working within the United States. We also recommend that ICE continue their investigation into the migrants within El Paso to determine identities if necessary. And we recommend that the FBI legal attaché offer assistance to Mexican police departments to help with their investigation in regard to his family. Moving on to the mitigate section, we recommend that the president work with various state governors to help declare states of emergency if necessary and deploy the National Guard under Title 32 of the US Code. We also recommend that we alert Customs and Border Patrol to enhance security measures along the southern border to help plug gaps left by the Mexican National Guard. And we also recommend the U.S. deploy the Public Health Service Commission Corps to provide critical health care, including distribution of Narcan to both migrant and U.S. Citizen communities. We also recommend that the White House release a public statement outlining the non-classified policy options that we recommend in order to facilitate public trust between the federal government and local communities. Finally, we recommend that the US initiate and expand existing and social media campaigns to, number one, address cartel propaganda led by the DEA, FBI, and DOJ. Thank you. We're open to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, team. Now for our judges for questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Thank you for briefing us. I really appreciate the overview of the situation. It sounds pretty serious. One of my questions was going to be, you talk about collaboration with Mexican law enforcement to try and stem the flow of narcotics and migrants over the border. Do we open ourselves up to that backfiring by working with Mexican law enforcement? You touched on that, but wanted to see what your recommendation was. How to balance the risk of leak with working with our counterparts in Mexico.
Unfortunately, sharing information with Mexico is an inherent risk of a leak, which is why we suggest that an initial task force be created to try to figure out what information can be safely shared with the Mexican government. With this information, as Hope said, we could create a bilateral response, but of course, in the meantime, this would have to be a unilateral response.
Thank you. I might have some more questions, but open it up.
To add to that, how smooth do you think this would go? And then can you explain a little bit about the agencies that are involved in the task force? What are their roles, responsibilities?
Yeah, so I can take that one. Specifically on the agencies that we selected, we feel that a partnership between intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies is the most effective in this situation because it includes both a broader national security intelligence threat, and we also need boots on the ground to help with the law enforcement capabilities. So, and on top of that, we're also prioritizing collaboration with Mexico. That's why we're including the Department of State in this, because we believe our partnership with Mexico is absolutely critical in this. And could you repeat the first half of your question? I apologize.
Yeah. How smooth do you think the relationship with Mexico and the US would be in this case scenario?
We do have some intel that the relationship is strained, as Hope mentioned. Secretary Blinken was there last year and the meeting didn't go as planned. And so obviously there's going to be some bumps in the road, but we truly believe that if we negotiate with Mexico in good faith, it's going to help the transition process and help them collaborate with us more.
It's also worth noting here is that this breach is on the Mexican side, so we'll be providing aid for them. We could let them know that there's an issue and then just help out as much as they want us to. So we wouldn't be doing anything invasive, and this could actually further to strengthen our relationship with Mexico.
Can I pull on that for a second? In the collaboration piece, right, we say that this is, you say it's a US-Mexico developed application tracks. Do you know who developed that? And is there gonna be challenges in compelling them to supply source code or to whomever's gonna do the investigation or to compel them to change the source code in a way that we can ask them to based on what we know? And can we share what we know with that company, not just the Mexican government, but the company that needs to implement those changes? How do we compel them and how do we share intelligence with them?
Thank you for the question. So yeah, this does pose a risk too. We should already have access to the source code because it is jointly developed. We also recommend including the computer emergency response team. So they would be the people to first look at it and triage the source code to see if there are any issues. That way we make sure things are done in-house within the government, and if needed, then we could contact whatever contracting company or agency help to develop the software, either for assistance if they deem it necessary, or to help roll out and develop the patch.
And just for clarification, we don't know who developed tracks. We don't have the intel for the private company.
And that's exactly why we feel we need the software bill of materials. If the software bill of materials is investigated, we can try to figure out whether this is a problem that occurred upstream with either open source code or a outside contractor that may have developed the app, or if it's internal, something that we developed internally.
I have some questions about the efforts to counter the propaganda through social media. And I'm just a little bit confused on, there's one part on the Department of Commerce has some role in it, then on the bottom part, to mitigate, you have DEA, FBI, DOJ. So can you talk a little bit about what kind of coordinated effort it would be, how we would, plan to counter some of that propaganda, and also, why do you view it as more of a mid or long-term versus something that we need to immediately take action on, given that the indoctrination seems to be rapidly advancing?
Just to kind of clarify on the timeline, we're not necessarily suggesting that these responses be delayed. We're instead anticipating these to take longer to implement naturally. In terms of the difference between the collaborate recommendation and the digital social media campaigns, I believe it's Twitter or X now, that has a feature built into the platform that allows users to fact check each other's posts. And we want to either utilize a similar program or other fact checking boards in order to kind of put that on other platforms as well, so that people are not necessarily seeing propaganda completely at face value. And that way they have a little bit more context for it, and then that will hopefully kind of stem the flow of recruitment in the US.
In addition to that, it's important to note that many of these agencies that we listed already have similar programs. As opposed to creating completely new programs, we would be rather redirecting effort that is already in place.
Okay, question about prosecuting companies. My understanding is that most of the production of fentanyl in particular is done illegally anyway, often by very small operations usually in Mexico rather than here. That's my understanding. Feel free to argue with me. But how effective do you believe you can be with an effort to prosecute these companies that have been evading prosecution for a long time anyway?
So on that specifically, we do have open source intel that a lot of these precursor chemicals are being imported from states like China. And so, though there is, of course, an illegal aspect to drug production, a lot of these are imported through official organizations that, albeit have been evading law enforcement, but do have formal bank accounts that we can freeze, assets that we can seize, etc. And we believe that a lot of the problem is access. The Mexican government's Department of Justice is very strained, and quite frankly, they don't have the resources that their American DOJ has. So we're really prioritizing granting more resources, and on top of that, our task force is also going to be able to find intelligence specifically of what companies going through. So we believe it's an access issue. That's why we're pulling in the DOJ. But we won't solve it overnight, but we do think we'll mitigate the importing specifically.
Many of these drugs too require very specific chemicals or to be processed in specific ways. So, I mean, the drug issue could still persist, but it may be with safer drugs. A drug like fentanyl, it's so potent that there's more likely to be deaths from overdose because of it. So it would be specifically, or especially those chemicals that we'd be targeting.
Okay, thank you.
Who's working with the victims or those recruited by social media and the recruitment tactics?
So specifically, can you rephrase the question as far as like helping the victims or the people working for the cartels that's being pulled into it?
Sure. So what are the considerations of prosecution? If they are committing crimes, how is that being handled?
So our task force, it has a mix of both law enforcement and intel capabilities. We're specifically going to use Executive Order 11333 to start doing federal wiretaps to like determine the extent of the compromise, and also we believe that DOJ mostly is going to be handling the prosecution.
In addition to that, many of these social media platforms already have privacy policies and terms of service that would allow us to gain information in terms of the identities of not only the recruiters, but those who are being recruited. IP addresses, email addresses, even internal communications that go through the app, these can be pulled. TikTok specifically has policies that say they will cooperate with any kind of requests that pertain to dangerous activities on the platforms.
And from there, it'd be primarily the FBI or DIA. Since this is an international and trans-state issue, it would be a federal law enforcement agency.